Welcome, and thank you for joining Beyond Recruitment at this morning's webinar in partnership with Megan Jenkins. By way of introduction, my name is Lisa Viz, CEO of Beyond Recruitment. The topic we will be listening today is leading change in challenge in challenging times. There's no doubt that 2020 has been a year of challenge, and there's no question that COVID-19 will continue to present challenges, not just globally, but locally, in the next 18 months at least. This topic, therefore, is just so pertinent to managing ourselves, managing our teams, and managing our organizations through these ongoing challenges. Megan Jenkins, our presenter and knowledge expert this morning, is currently a change manager at the Southern Cross Health Society. Megan will this morning explore with us how to develop change resilience and provide practical strategies for successfully leading through change and ultimately aligning in terms of change leadership. Megan has over 20 years experience as a registered organizational psychologist and has served in various internal and consulting roles, both in New Zealand and in the UK. Megan leverages her organizational psychology qualifications and background to build change capability with teams and leaders at her organization. You are welcome to submit questions during the webinar. Megan will have visibility of the questions during the webinar and will work through some of these throughout the session. If there is enough time and there are any themes that may not have been answered, we will collate these themes for Megan to answer at the end of the webinar. Best endeavours, we'll try our best. In case you think you've missed any parts of the webinar, please note that the webinar is being recorded and we will send this through to you as an attendee afterwards. You're most welcome to share this information with your colleagues or your teams. It now gives me great pleasure to hand you over to Megan Jenkins to proceed with this morning's content. Megan, a huge big welcome and over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa, and welcome everybody from wherever you're beaming in throughout the country. Gosh, you know, 2020 has been a real roller coaster, but I must say that having the ability to do these virtual webinars is probably one of the positives, I think, which has certainly come out of COVID. Before I get into this morning's content, what I wanted to do was just to give you a little bit of a snippet into what organisational psychology is, because there may be some of you who are not particularly familiar with the profession. Many are familiar with clinical psychology, and they are my colleagues who tend to deal with people who have more extreme sort of behaviours or mental aspects, and my very clever clinical psychs can help them through some of those times. Organisational psychology is exactly what it says. It's psychology. It's about people, about their mindsets and behaviours in organisations. And it's probably best highlighted through a study which was done back in the 1950s called the Hawthorne Studies. And this was a study which was actually in a production warehouse in the US. And what they were trying to do was really to ascertain for workers what was the best environment for the workers, both in terms of the heating and the lighting, for them to enable the best productivity. But what they did was that no matter what they did in terms of the lighting, so they increased the lighting, they increased it more, they increased it to quite a high amount, or then decreased it so that it was really quite dim, that what they found is that productivity actually just kept going up and up. And they certainly hadn't hypothesized this to be the case. Really what this highlights is that the workers actually felt that management cared about the environment that they were working in. So as much in business as we actually want businesses, we need businesses to be productive, there's actually this real important blend for people in businesses, and that we need people to be really motivated and really engaged to actually help that productivity as well. And that, in a nutshell, is what organisational psychology is. So let me head into what we're going to talk through today. And first of all, we're going to cover off, what does change mean from that individual point of view? We'll look at an emotional change curve, and also the 3 S's, which I see as really important to build that change resilience. Then I'll take you through some change management framework before we head on to how do we actually optimise all of this and best lead through change. So first of all, I'd like to share with you the emotional change curve. If you think about businesses through 2020, and probably one of the things that many of you may be grappling with, and many people may be grappling with, is that actually there's been a lot of restructuring of businesses. So people may be facing roles that have been disestablished for themselves or family members, but also there are the survivors who are left in the organisation. And what happens during change is that there is this typical change curve that people go through. So people can initially feel quite shocked and in denial about what is happening, and then go through some pretty low emotions as well before they start to then engage in the change and think towards what some of those new beginnings might be. Now you can see that sort of spinning arrows in the middle. So, the model certainly does not suggest that this is a really linear or easy process. In fact, it can be a little bit of a whirlwind where people from day to day might kind of flop to and fro in terms of these different stages. I remember early in the year taking a group through this at Southern Cross, and it was a department who were facing many, many changes in their ways. And this is even before COVID hit, before we even sort of had heard of COVID. And it was really interesting because, there were some people kind of going, okay, yeah, I kind of get that, there's a lot of change, there's a lot of digital transformation, and I do understand this, and I'm kind of trying to work through this as best I can to come to grips with this and form sort of the new ways of how we do things. But there were some people that were very much on the left-hand side of this curve. And when I spoke with those 2 people, it wasn't actually the amount of change that was happening at work. It wasn't the degree of that, it wasn't how overwhelmed they were feeling at work, but actually it was the things that were happening to them outside of work. So these people particularly had faced some loss in their own personal life, and so often when we think about change in organisations, it's really important to be aware of these different layers that people bring to work, and that it's not just about them in the work context, but it's actually things that are just going along naturally for them outside of their work that can be really adding to the challenge for them. But certainly, this is quite a good model to consider how people are going through change. And look, there might be, those of you who kind of go, yeah, I sort of get where I was when COVID first hit. And some of you might, be able to think about where you are now, a few months on. I think the key thing to consider with this is that we are all different. And it will depend not just on work, but other elements as well. So just a final note as well about this curve, and some of you may have seen it before, that it was actually born from research that a woman called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did back in the 1960s. And she was actually researching, not in organisations, but she was actually researching patients at their end of life, and came to see that there were some of these normal kind of stages that people would transition through, but that certainly, once again, you know, it wasn't a linear sort of progression through. It was certainly could be quite changeable from day to day or time to time. Right, so let's move on to looking at what I see are kind of the 3 S's in building change resilience for individuals. And we can think of perhaps another example here, and I'm sure that many of you will be facing this in your organisations, and that is just the fast growth of the digital world and how that is changing some of the processes in your organisation. So if we think about an individual in an organisation who is having to grapple with new processes and the challenge that he or she might be facing, and even being quite resistant to actually taking on some of this digital change. So one of the first things with change resilience is that you've actually got to understand who you are and why you are reacting in that way. You've got to understand, you know, the unique part of you and why that might be a positive in some situations, but actually when facing into something like a lot of change, why that might be a huge hurdle for you. I've found with working with a number of people and organisations through change that it can be the ones that are really conscientious or the ones that are actually really quite routine or structured that find change more difficult. So having that whole self-awareness is really important for them. The fact about people who are really conscientious is that that's exactly what they want to do. They want to finish the task, they want to feel competent. So any kind of changes will create a little bit of a wobble for them in that journey. So it's important for them to acknowledge that as much as that can be helpful in them reaching goals, that times when they're asked to kind of just bend slightly mentally or to pick up a new kind of way of doing things, that can be a little bit of a hindrance to them. Now, a second really important thing then, once people have that understanding of their need to change, is that whole sense of self-belief, or what we call in psychology self-efficacy. So this is really that sense that people have it within themselves to be able to change. So they might understand that what they have to do, but do they feel that they have the capability and the resources within them to actually do something about it? And this is a really important core concept in psychology and in people picking up change easier and being able to do that. And research has certainly found that those who adapt quicker to change are more open-minded and are more optimistic as well. So those personality concepts are really important. So even if people feel as if they don't have the tools, so this individual has never come across a digital process like this, you know, it's really important for them to actually be able to think about a parallel example of a time when they were actually able to break down a problem and to actually learn new skills as well, for them to feel as if they have that sense of self-efficacy that, you know, I can do this now. So that leads me on to the third S, which is really just to put in place what some of the simple steps are to actually overcome some of the challenges and to change and become more change resilient. And I like to break these into these three different categories of that psychological, the social, and then also the physical as well. So the psychological aspects are just everything that's in your mind. You know, we all have some self-talk. We all have some assumptions. You know, I never did well in school, so actually I think that I'm not very clever and I can't get my head around these new changes. To learn this new process might be an example. So it's really important to be aware of that self-talk, but also, you know, psychologically to be able to, as I mentioned before, kind of understand the problem, but be able to break it down into steps as well, so that the problem becomes smaller and bite-sized, and that you can actually feel as if you have the tools to equip you to handle those bite-sized bits, and that becomes more manageable for you. So certainly it's really important, you know, when we're feeling really overwhelmed, and I know that in our business and in many other businesses, people have found this year hugely challenging. And some people have become quite down on themselves as well, and kind of feel, you know, I'm so anxious, I can't do this. You know, now that we're able to get back into organisations, actually, I don't feel equipped to be able to go back into my workplace. I actually just feel really anxious about being around people again. It's really important to kind of be aware of what those anxieties or the more negative psychological factors are, and the negative thinking. But equally, you know, it's really important to balance that with what you can do, what your little wins are. And this, once again, really helps to build that self-belief and that self-efficacy as well. I remember doing a in-person workshop when we were able to do that back in the organisation, on leading yourself through change with a group of people. And there was one individual who was highly anxious and really quite emotional about coming back in. But the positive of being together in her team was that everybody actually said, you know what? You felt uncomfortable and you felt anxious, but you did it. You came in. So that sort of leads me to that second point there of that social aspect. And the fact that we are, as humans, we're social beings. If you imagine these webinars when we first went into lockdown, how amazing were kind of the crazy backgrounds, sort of the crazy hat days, or those kind of moments that we kind of tried to bond together and sort of bring that essence of team back into some of the virtual aspects. Even though we were still doing that all virtually. So that social factor is really important. That sort of leaning off other people, but certainly that learning off other people as well. So if you think about our person in the organisation who is finding it really difficult to grasp onto a new process, you know, one of the best things that that person can do is to actually have a look at a colleague who's kind of got it, and to ask them, you know, how did you approach this, and what did you do? And to look at how they could actually learn off that person. And that modelling and learning is a really human element, which is really important for all of us. We see that from a very young age in how kids kind of learn their behaviour as well off their role models. And thirdly, in terms of individual resilience, you know, there's nothing better than actually that whole physical well-being. And when people are feeling stressed, we certainly know that there are parts of our brain that are triggered. That whole fight or flight response, which makes us feel agitated. You know, it elevates our blood pressure and our pulse. It pushes the blood away from our major muscle group, or sorry, to our major muscle group, but away from our brain. So one of the things, though, that does is that it actually pushes the blood away from our brain and decreases our ability to think, our ability to have ideas, and our ability to problem solve through this. So there's nothing better than actually just getting out there and just doing one simple thing for your physical well-being in terms of exercise and just our whole physical side of things. So that's the end of sort of talking about the individual side of things. I can see that whether there are any questions here. No, there's no questions, so feel free to pop them in the chat, but I shall move on for now. So let's look now at what we can do to help ourselves and organisations to bring some of this understanding of change into a framework and a model that you can actually use. And what I'd like to draw upon here is ProSci. Now, ProSci is a global change management organisation who have been around for over 20 years, and they have developed what is called the ADKAR framework. Now, if you think back to when New Zealand went into level 4 lockdown, there was a lot of activity that was going on through our Prime Minister and her associates as well. You know, it wasn't just here, stay home, have a mask, and that's it. You know, there was a lot of pre-work that needed to be done. And what the ADKAR framework really does is to get you to understand that you can't just launch into any change, that you actually need to have a lot of that background understanding as to why we need the change and what it's going to be like for people before you actually ask them to do the change. So let's take a little bit more of a look through this ADKAR framework. And what we do know as well is that organisations that do change management well are 6 times more likely to meet the project outcomes of the change and within budget and also within the time frame as well. So first of all, think back towards how the government did prepare us leading into COVID and why we all, our team of 5 million, why we needed to actually buy into that lockdown. So that whole why is really important to understand and is really that first step in people being aware of what we need to do. And you may remember Jacinda saying the why was to flatten the curve and the why was to change lives. And secondly, we might understand the why, but actually we all need to buy into it as well. So this is where we really have that concept of what's in it for me or that with them. So what I need to do myself. And the government talked very strongly about that team of 5 million as well, and that we all had a part to play in that. So next, you've got that whole knowledge component. So I remember that when we'd moved out of level 3 and we were being welcomed back into Southern Cross, that we still needed to have some of that physical distancing. So one of the things that I think we did really strongly was to have really good leadership and a lot of clarity around what that would look like when we came back in, that we wouldn't just still be able to congregate in teams or sit close to each other. So we had established really clear guidelines around what it would look like, that we needed to sign in for the contact tracing. We needed to clean and clear both before we went into a workstation and then afterwards as well. And that actually we couldn't necessarily be close to each other like we might have enjoyed previously in team meetings. But if we were going to be booking a meeting room, to book one which was bigger so that we could leave a desk or leave a chair spare in between our workspaces or in that meeting room as well. So that's a knowledge piece. You know, what's it going to look like? And particularly, you know, what's different about this compared to the old pre-COVID? Once you've got that, and you need to have those 3 components sorted out and established well before you actually then invite people in. And then ProSci say that that ability part, so people going in and doing the doing and being skilled in that, that you need to have done that awareness, you know, the what's in it for me and the knowledge piece as well, that training, before you actually go live with any change. It was quite interesting because I went and got a coffee the other morning from Fonterra. They have a cafe which is open to the public there. And as I stood there, I witnessed these Fonterra workers walking in, and they had individual little desks there. And time after time, I watched these workers come in and do exactly the same routine, which was firstly to get the hand sanitizer and to sanitize their hands. Secondly, they got a handheld thermometer and they tested their own temperature on their forehead. And thirdly, they picked up a pen and actually wrote down their name and recorded their temperature. And it was amazing. I thought, gosh, that's just really ADCAR, that these people are coming in and that's their policy and procedure they have to keep their organisation safe. And what a clear demonstration that people actually know what's expected of them. They need to do each time that they come in every day. So once you've got people doing the doing, it's certainly important to kind of not really let off, because that's when people can actually revert back. So it's really important to just keep that whole reinforcement up. So to sustain the change. So one of the things that we do at Southern Cross is really work on the change capability build. So we've been working on a lot of training through teams and also leaders as well on leading yourself through change, which is what I mentioned earlier, for building change resilience, and then also for leaders, how to lead through change, and certainly how to lead in a VUCA world. So this concept of VUCA, or VUCA, may be one that you are or aren't familiar with, but it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. So, you know, I think that certainly sums up today's environment more and more with the changes that are going on. So really that reinforcement and building that culture of agility as well is really important, and to reinforce that through some of the things that you're doing in organisations. Another one that we do as well is to develop that growth mindset. So let me just check again and see if there are any questions. I do see here one from Anna. Thank you, Anna. So are there any tools, strategies you can recommend for managers or leaders to help identify team members who need more support or a different approach? Like a questionnaire. Yeah, I mean, you've got to be quite careful when people are feeling quite overwhelmed at sort of overdoing questionnaires, I think. People can find that it can be quite a mechanical thing to do. One of the things that we do at Southern Cross every year actually is that we do a wellbeing survey, and that's something that people expect every end of year in Southern Cross. But if you're wanting to pick up on something like that now, one of the things which I've successfully done with teams and leaders is actually to put change on the agenda, and just really to kind of use the conversation as to, you know, how's everybody going with it? You know, use it as kind of an open book and an open discussion around how people are feeling with it, what kind of changes that they're currently experiencing, what they see are the challenges, you know, how have other people dealt with these in the past? What could be ideas that you deal with these now? I've also put up that change curve, and I think that once you introduce a tool like that in organisations, don't let that just be a tick in the box, because it's really useful for people to actually then to revisit it after you know, a month or two, and just kind of go, right, you know, well, where's everybody at now? And I think it just really builds that transparency and builds that openness and discussion as well. Emma, do you use ADCAR for all changes? Yeah, you can, absolutely. You know, it's a wonderful model. We've just moved buildings, and certainly, you know, the ADCAR, we used that through the whole sort of 2-year process leading up to our relocation. But yes, the same with introducing teams, for example, in your organisation. Exactly the same kind of framework can be used for that. So yes, Emma. And I'm sure that those that have been doing change in organisations will appreciate that the framework may be the same, but really it's scaling that for the size and shape of it across your organisation, and however big your organisation is, that will be your internal knowledge and how you do it as well. Great, thank you for those questions. Let's move on to the leading through change. And I'd like to offer to you from ProSci research again what they see 5 really key competency for anyone in a leadership position in helping people navigate through change. And you know, this becomes more important with the greater and the greater number of changes, and certainly as things become more challenging, it becomes really important to just really strip that back to what some of these 5 key elements are that you can actually adopt in your organisation. I talked earlier about in Southern Cross, one of the things that I felt we were incredibly strong on right from the start in our COVID lockdown was around the whole leadership as a whole. But certainly our Chief People and Strategy Officer, Vicky Casely, was putting out weekly emails every Friday, and I heard a number of people comment about just how important that was for their whole sense of security, about their whole sense of kind of knowing what was happening and what we needed to do, what we needed to focus on, whether we were working from home or then when we were starting to transition back into the office as well. Like many organisations, we actually enabled all of our team of 700 odd across New Zealand to actually work from home, including all of our contact centre who previously had been on desktops. So even in that communication, there were simple things like if you're at home and you need to be safe in your workstation setup, how do I order a desk chair and an office chair so that I can have that in my home environment? So even simple things like that just helped provide that clarity, as well as that bigger picture as well as to why we were all doing this, to help flatten the curve and our part as a team of 5 million. So communication, not surprisingly, is at the top of that list. And ProSci also say that actually when you've got something to communicate, you need to do it between 5 and 7 times. And I'm sure, like many of you, you may also have quite a full inbox. So it's really important to think about what are the different ways of communicating as well, where you can reach people through change. Another one of the methods that we use is through our change champions in the organisation, and we used this really heavily during our relocation recently. And one of the things that I'd ask them to do is to actually go into Teams and hold some team time and to actually ask questions, so that if people were too busy and missing emails or missing a Yammer post on something or an intranet news article, that verbally that they were actually being asked, and for us to get a sense of where people were at, in the lead up to us moving and then afterwards as well. So communication, really, really important. And as well as that, to be an advocate for the change as well is really important. People have expectations of you as leaders, and they really want to see that leadership team being aligned as well. How would we have thought of Jacinda if we had seen her sort of out and about, without a mask, or moving about in large groups of people during our level 4 lockdown? It just really wouldn't have rung true for us. To be a coach is also really important. So remember earlier that we talked about the worker who was struggling to adopt new technology. So here, as leaders, people are wanting to look to you, not necessarily for the answers, but to help them find a resolution themselves. So that's where it can be really useful to ask those open questions around, and that understanding, I think, that you might be finding this change really difficult, but think about a situation before and how did you actually break that down, and what thinking, what resources did you use, and how could you apply this time? So it's really spending the time with people to coach them through that. And liaising with people as well is really important. So being a feeder to others in the organisation that can help as well. And then, of course, that resistance management too, where it's really important to call that out quite early as well. I remember that when I was doing some work with a department at Southern Cross, and I was doing some workshops for the leaders as well as some individual coaching sessions. And one of the leaders felt that people were just so busy and so challenged by everything and all of the changes that were going on, that leader actually dropped the one-to-ones because they felt that people were actually, didn't have the time for that. Whereas in hindsight, that leader realised that they were a really important link to actually helping people through the change, and that her role as a leader and a role model was really important, and that she could do a lot to support people. So as soon as she instigated those one-on-ones again, it made people feel important, that their time with her was important, and it really increased their sense of engagement, and that was shown in the engagement scores as well as her own leader scores as well. Couple of questions here. Change fatigue, yes, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we've really been grappling with as well. There is so much change. So one of the things that we do is not just that awareness piece. So often, that awareness through ProSci, people, they kind of understand why we're doing things. It's to add that customer value, or it's to reduce the administration time to lead to more people being able to do more proactive work. But it's the degree of the change. So one of the things which we've adopted, which has worked really well, is to actually provide visibility of a roadmap. And the other thing is that when we talk about that liaising with people as well, that for some people, they were finding that some of the changes, it was taking a long time to realise the benefits of them. So another thing that we did, and that team did, was that they brought in some of the project members so that the teams could actually understand all of the intricacies that went into developing this new process, and that it wasn't as simple as what they might have initially thought. So things like that can certainly help too. Also, managing one thing at a time as well can help. So overall, in terms of leadership, and remember the emotional change curve, it's not a one size fits all. It's about doing your one-to-ones. It's about really understanding your people. And, you are the best people to lead your teams through change because you are the ones that know your people best. I think it's important for you to just keep connecting with them and to keep that relationship up. Keep being visible and keep communicating regularly with them so that you are understanding kind of what place that they're in, and that you can keep providing some of the tools and further support, whether you're able to do that or you can bring in sort of other resources to do that as well. As well as that, I do just want to mention that your own self-care is really important. So that whole individual piece right at the start, don't neglect your own self-care, and that you will have your own journey through all of these changes and these challenges too. So finally, let's look back at that emotional change curve. And at the bottom there, they've got some really useful keys to engagement. So these can help you understand what people might need at different stages of this change process. So I'm sure you'll understand that when people are in that state of shock, they can't get their head around things. They're really, thinking what's happening. They just are finding it really difficult to come to grips with that, or are certainly in denial about what's happening as well. So that whole shock element was really big when COVID hit earlier this year. And even in our very sudden level 3 lockdown as well. So there, people just need that clarity and that communication. Simple communication, don't overload it. Keep it to kind of a few simple points and just repeat that, and keep that really easy for people to be able to mentally digest. Moving on from there, when people are starting to kind of understand what is happening, and understand, the environment that we're operating in, that's where it's really important to just kind of bring some of that empathy in. People there, you might see that they're beginning to feel really upset, or they might be showing some uncharacteristic emotion as well. And then when people move through to actually feeling really low, feeling as if they don't really know what to do from day to day, that's where you can help provide some of that empathy, but also some of that motivation, some of that coaching around, well, what's one thing that you might be able to do that has really helped you previously to cope with this change? For some people, it might be that physical element and getting outside and doing some physical exercise. For others, it might be using the support of other people and talking to people, and just really being able to download some of their concerns and some of their feelings around that. And then moving through to sort of that whole capability, that's when you can start to talk with people about what they can do to build their capability as well. And then moving through, once people are starting to see how to operate in that new beginning, it's really that whole knowledge piece. And people, we want to learn, we want to feel competent. Remember that that's at the core of our self-belief and our self-efficacy. So people are really keen to feel competent and to feel as if they can operate in this new norm as well. Let me just pause there and have a look at some of the questions again. So Dinesh, thank you. Are you able to elaborate on managing time, i.e. when and how long change can or should take place? Yeah, that's a really hard one, because I kind of think that it really depends on people's background experiences. It can depend on their assumptions as well. It can depend on kind of how many layers are going on for people as well, and how much else they're having to manage too. For some of us, working from home is great. We've got reduced travel time. Or we might get to see more of our kids as well, who are doing homeschool. But for other people, particularly at the moment, there is likely to be more those who have got family or friends overseas, with the rising COVID levels over there as well. So once again, it's a complex thing, Dinesh. But I think that you can really talk through and use some of these tools which I've given you to help people kind of get around things, and at work just focus on, right, what are the simple things that you can be doing at work to help yourself through this. You've talked about managing stakeholder expectations as well, given the current post-pandemic business world. and people don't adapt or take on change at the same pace. Yeah. Look, you know, there you can really focus the conversation on how are you going to, how are we all going to be still dealing with this personally? And how can we leverage off each other as a team for that team support and us working through that change? But also really, how can we align with what our stakeholders do expect from us? And, you know, as leaders, you can do this as well. What are some of the things that you should be doing and saying, and how you should be doing and saying this as well? So it's really just building up, what does that look like for people? Think about, you know, what's a time when you've done this well before, when you felt that you managed a stakeholder really well? Okay, well, let's kind of unlayer that. And what are some of the components that kind of made up that really good outcome that you had with that stakeholder? And then how do you actually present this now in a world when you're feeling mentally really challenged, but how you can sort of put that to side for a little bit to manage and deal with that stakeholder, so you have that good customer outcome and value. But still then, where's your downtime? How are you putting that space in yourself to create that healing and to create that kind of working through for your own change resilience? So Danette, I hope that helps. Right. Well, one of the things that I just wanted to finish on is that I'm a committee member of the Institute of Organisational Psychology. And during COVID, there were a number of org psychs through New Zealand that grouped together and actually compiled a whole lot of free resources, both for individuals, but also for businesses and leaders as well. So do feel free to go into that website and have a look and pick off some of the things which you think would be useful for you in your organisations. So thank you everybody for joining. Hopefully that's given you a really good insight into some of the complexity which is happening in the world still at the moment, both in terms of our work life, but also in terms of what might be going on outside of work as well, and some of the challenges that people will be facing in an ongoing way, and some of the tools that you can have from an individual resilience point of view, and both from that framework and also for people to lead through change as well. So now I guess we can go back to some questions. We've still got a few minutes to go. We've got a question here on the change budget is often neglected. Yes, I agree. People seem to just do the doing. So I think with anything from, you know, your strategy is that put change on the radar. You know, a lot of people prepare for finances. Why not prepare for the people element in terms of change? I definitely think that it needs to be on the radar. You know, that's that whole, what is the return on investment of that people element? And it is hard to quantify, absolutely. But remember that positive engagement and positive motivation for people does lead to performance for organisations. And there's been a lot of research which has shown that. And you're right as well, you know, that communication, it's really important to break through the clutter and just once again, have it simple, have it clear, you know, repeat it again. Another question here was any advice for someone who refuses to adopt the change and prefers to relitigate everything about the process they didn't agree with in a senior person? Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's really important to have that alignment at that senior level, as I talked about. A hard bit is managing that resistance, but it's really important to have that conversation about, you know, I've noticed you. So it's really important, as in any performance kind of conversation, to bring your observations, bring your facts. You know, you need to really be careful not to make it personal or make it personality based, but really create that openness in conversation, present the facts, and actually have that discussion around how helpful that person thinks that it is. But yeah, that is something which is really important to actually get onto as well. So thank you, Gail. What is your view on staying connected in terms of a large team who work from home for a portion of the week and connection is minimum? Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's quite interesting because we're finding that a few more people are coming back into the office, but it's definitely a conversation that needs to be had about what are some of those connection times that are equally important, and what are the expectations that you can have as a team. When we feel challenged and when we feel overwhelmed and stressed, our brains find it really hard to grasp onto new things. That's kind of our whole shutdown, our whole survival mechanism as well. So one of the things that we're focusing on is actually to think about what are some of those natural routines or rhythms when you did actually connect with people. And equally, for those who are actually working from home and still primarily virtual, it can be quite good to have some of those serious team meetings, you know, what are the goals and, you know, what's on the agenda and things like that. But even then, to have some more informal meetings where you might have a virtual lunch. So you're still kind of trying to bring some of that chit chat, some of that social time back in for people to really feel that sense of culture, which, you know, in this digital age, we don't want to lose as well, because that's still really important to preserve. Do we have time for one more question, I think, from Elk or Elke? Hope I've pronounced that, one of those right. How have you managed to prioritise which change needs to happen first when there are multiple changes happening within organisational level and a divisional level? Yeah, I think that'll really depend on, you know, what's your strategy and what's the benefit that is happening for your customers, and perhaps for the bottom line as well. But also, I think, as well as that, it would be, you know, what else is on the agenda? What kind of roadmap have you got? But certainly to bring that risk component in as well. So to do a risk assessment as well as to what might be the risk of not doing something. So that really, I think it's important to kind of have that whole overview of change and to have that whole change plan or change map, and to have that decision kind of at the senior levels and to make some decision around that. We do that on a quarterly basis, but then you're also wanting to kind of understand that flow-on effect and that change impact as well, so that you make sure that you've got a realistic view of how those changes could roll out to the best effect. Right. So, Rowena, at what point will you evaluate how far you have come and the changes you're leading? Yeah, that's a really good question. And that measurement and monitoring is really important. Um, That's probably quite a hard question to answer really definitively. I think once again, it will depend on how much change that you have going on. But one of the things that we did during our relocation is that when the change champions went into the teams and were asking every team meeting, or maybe every 2 team meetings, how people were feeling about the move, what changes or what questions they had. Once they got to that point where there was very little noise or no new questions, then that's quite a good point to think, right, that's good. And you can probably lessen off some of that facilitation, but then still you've got to have that whole reinforcement as well, which is really important. So I think there will be kind of looking at what some of your natural evaluation points might be, and your natural kind of times when you actually think strategically about how you're performing in your business, but also for people and groups as well, and to build that in. But clearly where there is more noise, or you see more of the behaviours that you don't want to see, then you need to kind of elevate the change a little bit more as well. Lisa, we're bang on 12.
Hi, am I live? Hi there. Thanks, Megan. That was so fascinating and so interesting. We probably have run out of time. I guess one key question that I wanted to ask, as last but not least, was 3 sort of key messages that you'd like to give leaders or people in terms of moving into 2021, having been through the type of year that we've been through, and building that resilience as we head into probably another year of continuous change.
Yeah, I'd probably say first and foremost would be that self-care for yourselves. And secondly would really be to highlight well-being in your organisation, just to kind of get that pulse on where people are, so that you can put some measures in place to help people through these challenging times. And secondly would be really to align your leadership team. And to utilise some of those key competencies that we've gone through today to continually refine and sort of help you lead through the change.
Thank you, Megan. That's great, and I guess the aligning of change leadership and sustaining change management as we go through continuous challenges is probably the content that we'll look at for the follow-up webinar that we run next year in February or March. So that'll be fantastic. So on behalf of Beyond Recruitment, I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning. I wish everybody all the best as we navigate our next steps on the other side of COVID-19 and into 2021. And as we prepare ourselves, our teams and our organisations for changes and challenges, impending, that it is important, as you said, that we self-care and that we build and take on strategies as leaders or as individuals that'll help us to cope through what we need to cope through. Just for everybody to know, this webinar has been recorded, and we will send everybody attending this webinar a recorded copy, and that'll probably be done by the end of this week. We also look forward to hosting more webinars with you, Megan. That's been very, very interesting and enjoyable, and good information for us to all take away. So I'd now like to say enjoy your day, everybody. Ngā mihi, and above all, thank you so much, Megan. Thanks.